March 6, 1944, contrails over Berlin. A site Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had been told could not exist. For 3 years, German fighter pilots had hunted over their skies with confidence because they believed in a line, a distance beyond which Allied fighters could not follow. That line defined safety for factories, rail hubs, and the capital itself. On that morning, the line vanished. From the Luftwaffe airfields, the reaction was a private collapse. Experienced pilots who had dominated the sky since 1941 stared at those silver streaks and felt something that is not often recorded in victories lists: the slow, sickening recognition that their doctrine, their training, and their gamble with resources had been outmatched not by miracle weapons but by reach. They understood immediately what reach meant. If escorts could arrive over Berlin, the Reich had no safe rear, no sanctuary for industry, no margin to recover lost pilots or burned fuel plants. For commanders like Galland and for aces hardened on the Eastern Front, the shock was personal. They had planned fights on their terms. Now they would be drawn into pitched battles over homes, factories, and civilians. This story is not only about engines and aerodynamics. It is about the human cost of a shifting geometry in war. It is about trainees sent up with fewer than 200 hours, replacing men who had learned instincts in years of combat. It is about mechanics in smoky hangars, about radar controllers recalculating range tables, and about men in Berlin who watched the sky and tasted defeat long before armies marched. It is about how a seemingly small technical choice, a different engine, a pair of paper drop tanks, an 85-gallon fuselage tank placed behind the pilot, redefined strategy and turned confident hunters into anxious defenders. Stay with this account to the end and listen to their side. The technical puzzles that betrayed them, the orders that failed to change in time, the private admissions from the top that the Luftwaffe could not answer this new reach. You will see how a single change in range, quietly applied, hollowed out an empire's air power and reshaped the map of 1944. They drew a line on a map and called it safety, and men died because they trusted that line. From the German airfields in 1943, the front line of the sky looked like a promise. Fighter controllers timed the American escort fuel limits as precisely as a clock. When P-47s and P-38s reached the agreed turn point, they peeled off and flew home. From that moment until noon, heavy bombers were on their own. For Luftwaffe pilots, it was a simple, measured business. Wait beyond the escort boundary, watch the contrails vanish, then strike. That discipline made the sky a hunting ground. They did not enjoy the kills. They practiced cleanliness in war. But they grew confident. Their calculations and intelligence reports agreed. Single-engine American fighters could not follow the bombers to the Reich's heart. They had that quiet assurance of men who have owned a kind of territory for years. On August 17, 1943, the calculation met blood. Lieutenant Robert Harriman's B-17 crew flew into that arithmetic and found it wrong for themselves. Harriman's formation had fighter cover only to the border. The escorts turned back. German pilots who had waited exploded through the bomber box. The No. 3 engine took cannon fire and burned. The tail was ripped away. The bomber went down. Only 3 of 10 crew escaped by parachute. 7 died in a spin to the earth. It was not the thunder of great guns or a heroic duel at dawn. It was the slow, mechanical betrayal of distance. The escort ran out of fuel. Men below paid the price. 3 weeks later, Captain James O'Connor's B-24 met the same arithmetic near Stuttgart. The P-38s escorted them as far as fuel allowed and then left. The bomber reports crackled. Under attack, 15 to 20 fighters. There were 40 bombers in formation and 300 German interceptors waiting. The right wing exploded from cannon hits. The B-24 rolled from 22,000 feet in a single terrible drop. 10 men died. The pilots had called for help. The answer was silence, the silence of engines that had to turn home. By October 1943, the toll was visible in numbers and faces. In a single mission to Schweinfurt, 60 B-17s were lost, roughly 20% of the attacking force. The second Schweinfurt raid, on October 14th, became a bruise on the Allied operation. 320 heavies went in, 60 were shot down, 600 men were killed or captured. More aircraft were damaged beyond repair. The 8th Air Force bled 194 heavy bombers in 3 months. The losses were not just statistics on a ledger. They were a mounting moral and operational crisis. Replacement pilots arrived with thin hours and thick fear. Men were trained in months but killed in missions. Bombing doctrine depended on massed formations and mutual defense, but the escort's fuel limits made that doctrine brittle. On the German side, the victories fed doctrine and confidence. Luftwaffe controllers learned the American turn points and timed ambushes. Pilots learned where to aim on a B-17 for the quickest kill. Engines, cockpit, wing tanks. The bombers' defensive guns were strong in theory, but a head-on run at 400 miles per hour could slice through defenses with a few clean passes. To a German pilot, the system seemed efficient. Intelligence predicted escort range, pilots executed, bombers died beyond the line. The airmen who returned carried the double weight of success and foreboding. Victory tasted like necessity, but some sensed the fragility of supply and trained men. They understood attrition differently. Each bomber they shot down was evidence of an enemy weakness, but every enemy raid also increased pressure on fuel, pilots and factories, and the war was beginning to show cracks Germany could not easily mend. In Washington and London, the arithmetic looked different. The bombers had the range to reach industrial centers deep in Germany. The problem was not the bombers' engines, but the fighters' reach. Without long-range escorts, the daylight bombing campaign would hemorrhage crews and morale. General Henry H. Arnold ordered a pause in deep penetrations. The Allies could not accept the attrition that threatened the plan for invasion. If the Luftwaffe kept biting American formations at the edge of escort range, Germany would keep time it did not deserve. More planes, more weapons, more trained pilots. The calendar of liberation would slip. For the men inside the formations, the fear was immediate and private. Bomber crews coined a phrase, "going naked." It was a physical image, a vulnerable body exposed to the elements, and an emotional one. Each time the fighters peeled away, the men in the nose and tail saw their odds in a new cold light. They memorized the map line like a promise of death. They timed the minutes to the turn like confessions. Some tried to stiffen themselves with jokes and songs. Others stared into the darkness of oxygen masks and thought of home. Few could say they were surprised when the Germans struck. They had rehearsed it in their minds. But expectation did not blunt the horror of watching friends fall in flames or of being forced to bail out over hostile territory, to be captured or killed in a country you had come to bomb. In the German control rooms, there was not only pride, but a deeper calculation that went beyond the immediate kill. The Luftwaffe had limited fuel, a patchwork of pilots, and industrial bottlenecks. They could, by fighting over points of their choosing, maximize American losses with fewer resources. That strategy was not meant to be cruel theatrics, but cold arithmetic. Each long-range loss the Americans suffered bought the Reich time to regroup. It was a bargain. Death for the enemy in exchange for a slower collapse. But bargains have limits when they face innovation. Psychologically, this moment pressed on identities. Bomber crews felt betrayed by the physics of fuel. Bomber commanders felt guilt, the kind that does not fit into reports. German pilots felt righteous in their technique, and, privately, nervous about the larger picture. Were they being drawn into a war of attrition they could not win? Commanders on both sides quietly asked questions that go unrecorded in headlines. How many more can be sacrificed before strategy changes? Who will pay the cost of doctrine that cannot adapt fast enough? The crisis had a human geography, lines on a map that decided who lived and who died, who fought at home and who fought far from it. In steel towers and mud-slicked control rooms, men who had trained for glory now trained for survival. Men who had once targeted bombers from a place of relative safety began to suspect that their sanctuary would not last. The Luftwaffe intelligence men wrote reports measuring range and capacity, and their confident numbers began to look like a bet. They had not yet known the measure of innovation that would come from an airframe and an engine, a tinkering in a factory, and a risk taken by commanders who wanted a solution. For now the line held, and it held terrible consequences. This is where the story begins, with maps, with mathematics, with men expecting a simple outcome and finding instead a hard calculus of lives. They had a method that worked until it didn't. They had courage and skill, but they also relied on a boundary that technology could erase. What they did not foresee was that a quiet technical change, a different engine, a clever fuel arrangement, a paper tank dangling beneath a wing, would rewrite that map. When that change appeared in the sky, the men who had hunted with confidence would feel something more dangerous than defeat, disorientation. They would have to fight where they never expected to fight, over their own cities, over their own children. The question that hung over every briefing room and farmhouse that kept control officers awake at night was now simple and terrible. What will you do when the line you trusted disappears? They called it a simple swap, an engine change. And that was the lie that hid the violence to come. For the Germans, the idea that a single-engine fighter could one day sit over Berlin and look down on their streets was laughable. Their intelligence reports, their engineers' calculations, even captured hardware told the same story. Single engines could not carry enough fuel, twin motors or nothing. That confidence let them plan ambushes at the edge of range and sleep at night. The Mustang, after a quiet change in a British workshop, would strip that confidence bare. North American aviation built the NA-73 quickly for the British in 1940. Early Mustangs had Allison engines and were fine for low-level work, reconnaissance, strafing, short missions. But the Allison lost power above 15,000 feet, where the big bombers lived. It was like asking a commuter car to perform as a racing car on a mountain pass. The shape was right. The engine was not. Then, a test pilot at Rolls-Royce, Ronald Harker, saw the Mustang and felt its bones. He did something practical and dangerous. He suggested putting a Merlin engine in the frame. The Merlin was not magic. It was a two-stage supercharged engine that kept power at high altitude. The change turned a good plane into a new kind of weapon. Think of it like upgrading a phone battery and processor at once. You keep everything you already like, the screen, the case, the apps, but suddenly your device runs longer and faster. For pilots, that meant being able to climb high, stay high, and outrun or outclimb the fighters that once bullied them. With the Merlin, the Mustang's top speed jumped, its ceiling rose, and its climb rate improved. Numbers that read like engineering bragging rights meant lives. 441 miles per hour at altitude, climbs to 30,000 feet in under 8 minutes, and most crucially, fuel capacity that turned range from liability to weapon. The airframe already had large internal tanks. Fitting an 85-gallon fuselage tank behind the pilot and two 108-gallon external drop tanks pushed the total to about 400 gallons. In practice, that stretched a single-engine fighter's combat radius from a few hundred miles to more than 800. Suddenly, Berlin was within reach. But every advantage carries a price. The 85-gallon fuselage tank sat behind the pilot and changed the plane's center of gravity. A full fuselage tank made the Mustang unstable in pitch. Pilots reported terrifying behavior. During hard pullouts, the controls could reverse, forcing them to push forward on the stick to stop the nose from pitching up further. In other words, a Mustang could try to tumble under certain conditions. The fix was simple in theory and lethal in practice. Burn the fuselage fuel first. Pilots had to climb with that weight aft, then manage tanks so the aircraft would handle normally in combat. That required discipline, calculation, and calm under fire. Imagine your daily commute. You walk out with a heavy pack slung over one shoulder. If you take a curve too fast, you stumble. So you learn to shift the pack, to move the weight, to step carefully. Now multiply that stress by hundreds of miles, by radios that scratch and burst with enemy chatter, by the visceral fear of flak and tracer. Pilots learn to treat fuel management like a habit as automatic as fastening a seatbelt. They timed fuel burns, switched tanks, jettisoned drop tanks when empty, and kept a strict watch so they would not be caught with the wrong fuel distribution at the worst possible moment. Mechanics measured and labeled tanks like a surgeon labels instruments. One mistake in a minute could become a life. The Germans did not anticipate this kind of disciplined fuel choreography. Their calculations assumed stable center of gravity designs or twin engines for range. They examined Mustangs and found nothing revolutionary. An airframe with more internal fuel than they expected, aided by disposable tanks. Intelligence officers assumed there must be a trick, a hidden auxiliary tank, a special fuel line. When they recovered wreckage, they found paper drop tanks made in Britain, simple and effective, not secret at all. The revelation was worse than a surprise weapon. It was a new doctrine born from manufacturing and logistics. Mass-produced Mustangs with Merlins and drop tanks could be everywhere. This strategic shock had a human face. German pilots who had been celebrated for years suddenly had to imagine fighting under different rules. Aces hardened on Eastern Front patrols, like those who read range tables and trusted them, had to ask themselves how to fight when the enemy could choose where and when to engage. Military pride is stubborn. Doctrine is slower to change. Many Luftwaffe men felt betrayed not by individual commanders, but by the physical world they had relied on. They had planned battles around a geography of fuel. That geography changed overnight. For bomber crews, the Mustang's new range was a promise of survival. For the men who had been going naked, it meant the possibility that the long span of ocean and land that once left them exposed could be reclaimed. But even among allies there was skepticism and peril. Pilots with little time in the Mustang were handed new responsibilities. Mechanics who had never worked on Merlins had to learn quickly. Packard in the US built Merlin variants under license, and production surged. But every new aircraft needed fuel systems checked, control surfaces balanced, and tank seals secured. The margin for error was small. You can see echoes of this in everyday life. When a new model of car promises longer range, drivers don't just rejoice, they worry about maintenance, range anxiety shifts, and insurers rework policies. Small technical changes ripple into logistics, fueling stations, maintenance habits, training. In wartime, these ripples kill and save people. A change of engine is not only horsepower on a chart, it is a supply chain that must be fed, mechanics who must be trained, pilots who must unlearn old instincts. The German side felt this as a tightening no one could stop. Factories could build more fighters, but they could not make another season of experience overnight. The Mustang's combination of speed, handling, and range forced hard choices on both sides. German commanders argued about where to commit resources, to home defense or to distant fronts. Pilots returning from missions reported different skies. Some told of Mustangs that pursued them into the suburbs of their cities, machine guns chewing at tail fins. Others described the slow mental feed. The once reliable margin of safety had shrunk until it was gone. For a pilot used to being the hunter, it is a particular shame to become the hunted over your own backyard. Morale took hits that no statistical report could fully measure. There were also moments of quiet irony. British technicians who recommended the Merlin knew little of the emotional toll their decision would have on the German crews watching the skies over Berlin. Their work was practical. Make an engine that keeps pressure in thin air. But the human consequence, pilots in another country realizing they could no longer choose the field of battle, was a byproduct no engineers signed up for. Engineers do not usually measure shame. They measure torque and thermal efficiency. Yet their work reshaped how men felt about safety, honor, and inevitability. This new reach did not instantly solve every problem. The fuselage tank issue remained a hazard, and early Mustang units had to learn management procedures quickly. Some pilots flew with the terror of a possible control reversal in mind, sweating through long missions. Others developed rituals, a light tap on the instrument panel, a whispered check to the wingman, a glance at the numerals tracking fuel flow like a heartbeat. Those small rituals kept aircraft and crews alive. They also created an intimate bond between pilot and machine that was not mechanical but emotional. You trust your life to a metal shape, a fellow airman, and a routine you must perform again and again. For the Germans, this meant a new kind of warfare they were unprepared for. Attrition not just of aircraft, but of certainty. The Mustang had not arrived like a thunderbolt. It spread through units carefully, gradually, its impact compounding as more planes with Merlins entered service. By the time German intelligence could confidently report the change, the Allies had already begun to translate the new range into tactics. Persistent escorts, deeper raids, a psychological pressure that no factory or pilot reserve could solve quickly. If you have ever adjusted to a new technology that made your long-used habits obsolete, a new program at work, a smartphone that changed how your family communicates, you know how private the feeling can be. It is not only the nuisance of learning, it is the loss of an old confidence. For the Luftwaffe, watching Mustangs appear over places they considered safe was like watching the ground shift beneath their feet. It forced the question they had tried to avoid. How do you fight when your map has been redrawn? Before this became a strategic advantage for the Allies, it was a battleground of small human decisions, a technician tightening a fuel line, a pilot learning to burn the aft tank first, an intelligence officer rechecking war tables. Those small acts compounded into a capability that Germany had not expected and could not quickly stop. That is the danger of underestimating simple changes. They rearrange power without the poetry of overwhelming force. The result would be a bitter, grinding attrition for the Germans and a new, fragile hope for Allied crews. If you want to see how that fragile hope turned into an operational gamble, how commanders and pilots turned these technical facts into a plan that sent Mustangs deep into the Reich, then click the red button in the corner and subscribe. Join a community that listens to the voices often left out of victory parades. The pilots forced to adapt, the mechanics working at night, and the men on the other side who watched their world shift. Your subscription keeps these stories alive and helps us remember the human cost and consequence of small, powerful changes. Click now and stay with us. The next chapter will show a risky promise turned into a dangerously beautiful reality. 48 Mustangs lifting at dawn, flying to Berlin, and a gamble that would change the air war forever. Donald Blakesley came back to the 4th Fighter Group not as a theorist, but as a man who had learned the price of being wrong in combat. He had flown with Eagle Squadron pilots alongside the RAF and returned to the USAF with scars and a stubborn belief. If you could match the enemy at the place he thought was safe, you removed his advantage. When he saw the Merlin-powered Mustang, he did not see numbers on a chart. He saw a chance to close the map that had been killing bomber crews. He pushed for Mustangs, not because they were glamorous, but because range could translate into lives saved. Converting a whole group in weeks was not a bureaucratic checkbox. It was a tight, dangerous choreography. Blakesley argued with Major General Kepner until the general finally offered a test. Give me the planes, and I'll have his men combat ready within a day. If he failed, he would lose command. That threat sharpened every hand at Debden. When the first P-51Bs arrived on February 26, 1944, men who had been wrenching on radial engines now faced a liquid-cooled V-12 with different habits, warm-up sequences, oil temperatures to watch, and a temperamental supercharger system that changed how you climbed and fought. Mechanics studied manuals with the intensity of men reading last wills. They traced fuel lines, learned to bleed radiators, checked magnetos and ignition timing, and learned the Merlin's need for clean oil and steady attention. The drop tanks had to be fitted and plumbed. The paper tanks made in Britain were simple, but needed reinforcement at the fittings. Every P-51 required 6 guns loaded, belts checked for fouling, and the 85-gallon fuselage tank sealed correctly behind the pilot. If a seal failed at altitude, the fuel could slosh, change balance, and turn a dogfight into a death spiral. They worked through the night, not because they loved engines more than sleep, but because delay could mean bomber crews flying without cover and friends dying. Pilots learned in the air as much as on the ground. Some had flown Spitfires with the RAF and already knew Merlin quirks. Others had only P-47 hours. Blakesley accepted that and used it. He taught them a simple doctrine: climb hard, keep top cover, and manage the fuselage tank like it is your heartbeat. Pilots practiced switching tanks, learned the exact moment to jettison drop tanks, and rehearsed emergency procedures until the motions were automatic. On the first few missions, some pilots had fewer than 30 minutes in type before takeoff. That would terrify most commanders, but Blakesley understood human learning under pressure. He trusted training that sharpened reflexes and the kind of cohesion that forms between a pilot and an aircraft when both are treated with respect. In briefing huts at dawn, the language was plain and tight. Burn the fuselage first, Blakesley would say. Climb to 30,000, take the sun, and deny them the angle. If your guns jam, keep position. Keep the bombers between you and the ground. Those sentences were instructions and reassurance. They turned fear into a plan. The pilots repeated them until the words sat in the mouth like a prayer. That ritualized repetition is what kept men alive when the sky filled with tracer and the ground below looked like a collage of shattered towns. What happens when you give men new tools and tell them to act like veterans overnight? Ground crews became improvisers. Spare parts were not always where you expected them to be. Production lines were stretched. Mechanics cannibalized damaged Mustangs for instruments and fittings, adapted British fittings to American supply, and invented temporary fixes that worked until better parts arrived. They learned to spot stress fractures in wing spars from vibration peculiar to the Merlin's power curve. They taped, riveted, and prayed. These were not glamorous acts. They were necessary and intimate work. The kind of labor that reads meaningless in monuments, but means the difference between a pilot making tea at home or never returning. The human relationships tightened. Pilots and crew chiefs became almost proprietary. Each ground team learned the idiosyncrasies of a single aircraft and its habitual noises. A pilot would run his hand along riveted skin and listen for a sound the crew chief could hear with an oil rag in his teeth. Those small intimacies became trust. They also became sorrow when a familiar machine returned in pieces. Men mourned aircraft with the language of loss. She didn't come back. As if metal could be human. That sorrow hardened the group into something like family. Behind the immediate hustle was a strategic pressure. General Doolittle and the 8th Air Force needed a systemic fix, not a trick. One Mustang in action was a curiosity. Dozens were a tool. Blakesley's promise to have his group ready fast was not merely bravado. If the 4th could prove the P-51's capability, the 8th could begin converting other groups, change doctrine, and restore the bombing campaign's momentum. Commanders in Washington and London watched with equal parts hope and impatience. The invasion timetable hung behind every decision, making delays more dangerous than audacity. How do leaders decide when risk is worth it? When the lives of many depend on the nerve of a few. Training schedules were brutal. Men slept poorly, ate when they could, and learned to run missions on micro-sleeps and mechanical memory. Flight instructors drilled fuel switch sequences until they were reflex, and navigation officers practiced timing rendezvous over points on the map like drum beats. The flight planners agonized over headings and altitudes, knowing that a few degrees error could put an escort out of position and expose hundreds of men. The planning rooms smelled of maps, cigarettes, and the cold sweat of people awake at night with responsibility. Pilots told stories to manage fear. They joked about the Rolls-Royce being a luxury engine that liked tea, or they cursed drop tanks as ballast for the brave. Those jokes served a purpose. They turned dread into shared culture. Humor softened edges, but did not erase the calculation. Each man knew the geometry of risk, as well as the lines on a map. They counted gallons, not dreams. The psychology of repeated danger meant rituals, equipment checks, a song humming in the nose, the same pre-takeoff gesture to a wingman. These small acts anchored minds before flight. In Debden's hangars, there was also tension with the British. They knew more about Merlins, but American radios and instruments differed. The Packard-built Merlin engine, the V1650, was reliable, but required adjustments. British technicians exchanged knowledge in terse professional terms. There was mutual respect and the occasional cultural clash. The Brits tended toward quiet practicality. Americans tended toward bold improvisation. Both approaches combined into a functioning machine. By the end of February, the 4th flew its first P-51 escort missions to France. The initial sorties were tests and proofs. Every aircraft returned. The men were exhausted but relieved. For bomber crews, the sight of Mustangs climbing above their boxes was a revelation. Silver spears of hope pushing away the dark. For German pilots, those early missions were a curiosity they noted and filed for intelligence. They did not yet grasp the tidal force of what they had seen, and yet beneath the relief lay a shadow. The fuselage tank remained a potential killer if mismanaged. Pilots had to resist adrenaline in combat and remember to check gauges. Weapons sometimes jammed. Radios died. The margin for error was thin. A pilot could be a hero in training and a statistic in a moment's lapse. That knowledge created a quieter fear, the kind that sits in the chest and does not make a sound. It sharpened the pilots, but it also brought home the human cost of mastery. What will you do when your lifeline is also your danger? As March approached, the 8th prepared to attempt what had been written off as impossible: deep escort to Berlin. The conversion at Debden was a small, crucial proof. It showed that men could learn fast, mechanics could bridge gaps, and commanders could transform doctrine. But proofs in workshops are not wars. The question remained whether human beings, exhausted, anxious, brave, could perform a high-risk choreography under fire. The stakes were not abstract. They were the faces of men who had been going naked, the burned-out B-17s, the parched names on telegrams sent to mothers. Blakesley's pilots climbed into their Mustangs with that weight in their pockets. They were not seeking glory. They were trying to solve a moral problem: how to keep other men alive. The rest would be decided in the sky. They lifted at dawn, 48 silver birds cutting the grey into neat slashes. For the men on the ground at Debden, it was a simple, terrible arithmetic: weight, throttle, runway length, and the knowledge that every gallon counted. The Mustangs rolled forward, wings bowed under drop tanks, engines a steady roar that sounded like hope turned into motion. Pilots checked their straps, flipped switches, and felt that thin, private terror that sits under the bravado. How long will the fuel last? Will the guns fire? Will the radios hold? These were not questions of legend. They were the daily ledger of survival. The flight east was long and boring in a way only soldiers know. Hours of flat sea and low lands teach a man to watch tiny things, a contrail forming on the horizon, a change in cloud texture, the way the wind whispers over a wing. Pilots logged the minutes and checked gauges like people counting heartbeats. The bomber stream was ahead, a long silver ribbon moving slowly to the Reich. The rendezvous over the Netherlands came exactly on time. 48 Mustangs climbed to top cover and seated themselves 5,000 feet above the heavies. From below, the B-17s looked like churches of metal, lined in neat pews. From above, they were fragile and precious, boxes of men and fuel that must not be breached. Crossing the German frontier felt like crossing a moral line as much as a map line. For the Luftwaffe men on alert that morning, the scene was strange and wrong. Thin contrails where no contrails should be. Single-engine fighters high above the city they had treated as sanctuary. The German scramble rooms filled with people who had prepared their whole lives to fight in certain conditions. Their calculations had been right for years, until they weren't. Men who had trained to exploit a predictable boundary now watched it disappear like fog at noon. The psychological blow is hard to quantify. It is the loss of certainty that had long steadied hands. Contact came sharp and brutal. At 09:58, the bombers attracted attention, and the sky changed from ordered motion to violence. German fighters dove from above and ahead, seeking to slice the bomber boxes apart, in the few minutes after American escorts had historically departed. The Mustangs reacted as they had been taught. Break left, engage, protect the bombers at all cost. For 7 deadly minutes they fought. Guns barked, tracers carved thin lines through blue. The noise was physical, metal on metal, engines screaming, radios full of clipped calls. Bandit at 1 o'clock, break left, watch 3 o'clock. In the middle of the chaos, Blakesley felt his guns jam. He could have retreated. Instead, he kept the bomber group between himself and the German attackers, a human shield in silver paint. His wingmen took the kills. The math of fuel returned to the foreground after the scramble. Ammunition dwindled, gauges slid toward empty, and each pilot had to decide when to let a fight go and when to risk the return with adrenaline still hot. Every aircraft in the 4th's assigned bomber group reached the target unharmed by enemy fighters. That result was not a small thing. Across 3 months before, bomber losses had been horrific. Hundreds of aircraft lost, crews killed or captured in numbers that made telegrams a constant part of life in small American towns. To see your charges make it to the target was a relief beyond words. When the B-17s went through Berlin's flak and bombs fell below, the sky over the city wrote an ugly script in smoke and fire. For German civilians and workers, the first sharp terror was not from fighters, but from an old familiar fear. The ground erupting in iron flashes and rubble, the work of bombers. But then the contrails, the Mustangs, drew attention away from the ground to the sky above a city that had thought itself safe. In Göring's office they watched them. The Reichsmarshal saw single-engine fighters loafing at 30,000 feet above his capital, and understood in an instant what every technical man had missed. Range had become the decisive fact. It was not a spectacular secret weapon that arrived like an overnight miracle. It was a simple, brutal truth. Enemy fighters could now be where German leaders had assumed they would not be. That realization has a flavor of private panic, less the loud cries of defeat, and more the cold clutch of final arithmetic. They came back on fumes. Blakesley landed with 20 gallons of fuel left, barely enough for 10 minutes. The mechanics, who had prepared the planes before dawn and now prayed over the damaged skins, looked at that display and understood fully the margin they had been given. Each aircraft rolled in on fragile threads of fuel and luck. Men who had flown those sorties felt a mix of triumph and weariness that does not fit in a medal ceremony. They had done what had been declared impossible, and what it meant would unfold in less than 48 hours. Germany responded by gathering everything it could. The follow-up on March 6th was monstrous in scale. 800 bombers and more than 900 fighters mounted toward Berlin. The Luftwaffe pulled units from the Eastern Front and Italy, and men who had thought the war was distant now found themselves thrown into a colossal air battle above cities and factories. The engagement that day became known as Black Monday. It was one of the largest airborne clashes of the war, and nowhere did the losses wear a fair face. The Luftwaffe had changed tactics. Instead of a straightforward run at the bomber streams, commanders ordered attacks on the escorts themselves. Break the screen, and the bombers would be vulnerable. The German pilots tried to separate our fighters, to scatter them, to turn cohesion into chaos. The P-51s answered with the ferocious professionalism of men who had less to spare and everything to gain. Across the sky, engagements erupted in dozens of small wars at once. Dive and climb, split S, head-on passes, and the intimate terror of metal ripping through air. Reports later tallied German losses between 66 and 81 aircraft, according to their own records. American claims were higher, inflamed by the smoke and excitement of combat, but either way the cost was severe for both sides. Black Monday was not a clean victory for the Allies. 69 heavy bombers were lost that day, 53 B-17s and 16 B-24s. 11 American fighters did not come home, including 4 from the 4th Fighter Group. Numbers like these are blunt instruments. Behind them are families, telegrams, and the slow sorrow of towns. Yet the psychological effect on the Luftwaffe was profound. Pilots like Major Günther Roll, hardened on the Eastern Front with hundreds of victories, now met P-51s at almost 28,000 feet, and reported a new calculation. These Americans could now dictate where battles happened. Steinhoff, another experienced German ace, came back with bullet holes and a shaken admission. That Mustang followed me all the way down. When men who had once felt sovereign in the sky confess bewilderment, the meaning is raw. The strategic attrition that followed was brutal. By the end of March, the Luftwaffe had lost more than 400 pilots killed or seriously wounded in battles over Germany. These were not replaceable in the way tanks could be replaced. A pilot's skill is measured in years of missions and the bones of experience, and Germany simply could not speed that training without paying dearly. Training programs collapsed under demand, fuel shortages tightened, and German industry, already under relentless bombing, could not deliver pilots with proper hours. Factories could make airframes. They could not forge gutless courage overnight. Each veteran lost multiplied the damage. Allied tactics shifted to take advantage of the new geometry. P-51s did more than cover bombers. They flew fighter sweeps to German airfields ahead of the formations. The idea was simple and merciless. Don't just meet the Luftwaffe over the target. Find them before they scramble and break them where they are most vulnerable. Airfields were strafed. Aircraft on the ground were set aflame. Fuel dumps and maintenance workshops turned into long lines of fire. The math was terrifyingly efficient. For every P-51 lost in these ground assaults, German units often lost 10 aircraft on the ground, along with trained pilots and the infrastructure needed to support flight operations. The effect rippled outward. By April 1944, bomber loss rates had fallen from the brutal highs of late 1943, around 8% per mission then, to under 2%. That drop is more than a statistic. It represents saved lives and a practical opening for operations like the planned invasion of Normandy. On D-Day, when Allied soldiers crossed the beaches on June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe could muster only around 100 sorties over the invasion area. The Allies flew more than 14,000 sorties. The difference is a gulf, and it was paid for by months of attrition in the skies over Germany. For German pilots, the change was not only physical but moral. They had been trained to fight on advantageous terms. Now they had to fight everywhere, even over their own factories and cities. That meant more danger to civilians and a constant erosion of confidence. Göring and his commanders understood that the balance had shifted, and they had no real remedy. Fuel and pilots were draining away faster than production could replace them. Some German leaders made desperate proposals and demanded miracles. Hitler demanded more aircraft and more sorties, without giving the resources that were needed. The administration became a chorus of impossible demands and diminishing capacities. On the Allied side, there was no triumphalism without cost. The P-51's reach depended on an industrial and human chain, the factory line, the logistics of fuel and drop tanks, and the relentless work of mechanics whose names seldom appear in history books. Those crews changed engines in rain and mud, patched wing spars under blackout lights, and loaded belts of un-800 rounds into each aircraft before dawn. Their labor was a silent engine of victory. Without them, the tactical advantages of aircraft would have been wasted. Black Monday and the missions that followed left a clear footprint on the Luftwaffe's map of possibility. German pilots noticed a change in how battles started and where they ended. They felt exposed, not just in the sky, but in memory, the shame of being attacked on home soil, the erosion of the belief that one could always choose the battlefield. That psychological erosion is as costly as metal and fuel. Men have limits to how much uncertainty and fear they can carry. When those limits were reached, the Luftwaffe's ability to fight effectively unraveled. In interrogation after the war, Göring admitted what everyone in command rooms had by then accepted. Long-range fighters changed everything. When single-engine escorts began to appear over Berlin, the Luftwaffe's strategic depth was gone. It was a recognition not of betrayal by men, but of a defeat of a structural kind. The Allies had solved range, and that solution made the bombing campaign sustainable in a way it had not been before. The consequences were immense. Production lines that could no longer operate in peace, a pilot corps hollowed by losses, and a civilian population living under the double threat of bombs from above, and fighters that could now choose their skies. The sky that had once felt like a shield for German industry now looked like a sieve. Every mission chipped away at the Luftwaffe's capacity to respond, and the Allies kept pressing the advantage. For the men on both sides, the air war had become a test of endurance, training, and the hard arithmetic of supply, not just a contest of skill in the cockpit. The result would be a dramatic rewriting of air power in 1944, one that would leave scars on pilots, cities, and commanders. The Silver Mustangs had become a new standard, not merely faster or better armed, but able to be where they were most needed. That ability, more than any headline score of planes destroyed, was the weapon that bent the air war toward Allied victory. When the sky gave up its secret, the world below changed more slowly than the contrails suggested. The P-51 did not strike like a singular thunderbolt. It arrived as a chain reaction of decisions, of factory shifts, of long nights in hangars, and of hundreds of small human acts. Together, those acts rewrote a map of safety and danger. By spring 1944, the consequences were unmistakable. Bomber loss rates that only months earlier had cost 8% of a mission fell to under 2%. Production lines that had sputtered under attack began to feel the steady pressure of sustained bombing. The air that had once sheltered German industry became a battlefield it could not control. For German pilots, the change began as confusion, then hardened into sorrow. Men who had learned to navigate a geography of fuel and time found their landmarks erased. Experienced aces like Günther Rall and Johannes Steinhoff described a feeling that was not simply defeat, but a loss of agency. They had taken pride in choosing the field of battle. Now they were scrambled to defend what had once been safe. The horror for many was not the casualty count alone. It was the knowledge that they were being asked to fight more frequently over cities filled with civilians, to risk careers and lives to protect factories that kept the war moving. The shock did not erase courage. It eroded certainty. Civilians in German towns and cities felt the new geometry differently. Where once raids had been a frightening but intermittent fact of life, now danger could arrive by day and night, from bomber streams overhead and from fighters that could sweep down to strafe airfields or to break formations. For workers in factories, the choice between reporting for duty and running for shelter became daily. Children learned that the sky could be both protection and punishment. Planes that once defended their country now carried the possibility of ruin. These were not abstract effects. They were family stories of lost homes, temporary refuges, and the slow collapse of normal life. The Luftwaffe faced a more technical, but no less human, crisis. Training pipelines could not produce veterans overnight. Between March and May 1944, the Luftwaffe lost hundreds of veteran pilots, men with years of hard-won skills and instincts. Factories could roll out airframes by the thousands. Over 18,000 Mustangs were built in a few years. But skill cannot be stamped into a crate. Replacement pilots arrived with limited hours and little real experience under fire. The arithmetic of war is unforgiving. A squadron without veterans suffers more losses, and those losses feed back into a shrinking pool of skill. Fuel shortages and damaged infrastructure made the problem worse. Machines and men are not interchangeable. There is a moral weight to these facts that deserves attention. The Allies needed air superiority to prepare the way for the invasion of Europe. The P-51's reach provided that superiority. The result was a shorter path to the beaches of Normandy, and likely fewer casualties on the ground in the long run. Yet the same capability also intensified bombing campaigns that struck industry and, inevitably, civilians. Factories were legitimate military targets, but they were also workplaces filled with people whose lives were not military calculations. The German perspective, families losing loved ones in cities turned into battlefields, reminds us that strategic success carries human cost that does not vanish in victory parades. Mechanics, loaders, and factory hands paid in sweat more than in headlines. They were the quiet backbone of the change. At dawn, crews loaded 6 guns with 1,800 rounds, checked every control surface, sealed fuel tanks, and tested magnetos. When a pilot returned with holes in his fuselage, those crews worked through the night to make him fly again. Those names are mostly absent from statues, yet their labor determined whether a mission launched or a bomber flew without escort. Their work saved lives and shaped the course of the war just as surely as aerial tactics did. Commanders felt the consequences in broader strategic terms. Hermann Göring admitted after the war that long-range fighters were decisive. That is not an attempt to simplify the many causes of defeat. It is an acknowledgement that when one side gains the ability to be present where it matters, the other side is forced into hard choices: redistribute scarce fuel and pilots, defend everywhere and thin forces, attempt miracles that resources cannot support. The Luftwaffe tried many responses: tactical changes, shifting priorities, desperate mobilizations, but none addressed the root. The Allies could now insist on the time and place of battle. The P-51 story is also a human mirror because it shows how technology amplifies people's instincts. On the Allied side, the Mustang let bomber crews off a long existential treadmill of fear. Men who had once counted minutes until their escort turned back breathed with something closer to relief. But relief did not mean the end of risk. Men still flew long missions, still faced flak and fighters, and still came home damaged or not at all. On the German side, pilots and civilians faced a new, ghastly intimacy with danger. They learned what it feels like to be fought over at home. Empathy does not erase responsibility, but it deepens understanding. We can draw a broader lesson. Wars pivot not only on single battles or famous weapons, but on the slow accumulation of technical choices and the human systems that support them. The Merlin engine installed in a particular airframe, the decision to fit drop tanks, the factory line that made thousands of Mustangs, the crews that kept them flying, each small decision interacted with others. The result was a systemic advantage that the Luftwaffe could not match in time. That is history's sometimes quiet lesson. Change the logistics and you change outcomes. Change the human support and you change the balance of power. If you look at the map of 1944, you see more than arrows and strategic objectives. You see a human map of choices. Mothers waiting for telegrams, mechanics wiping oil from their hands, pilots rehearsing fuel switches under breathless clouds. You see commanders weighing invasion plans against casualty curves, and you see a people living under a sky that had become a theater. The P-51 was a decisive tool, but tools do not make decisions, people do. The weight of those human decisions is the reason history matters. So reflect with care. Consider the view from both sides. The bomber crew who called these fighters little friends because they were hope in metal, and the pilot who once hunted freely, now hunting for his own neighborhood's survival. Consider the workers whose labor turned designs into reality, and the civilians who bore the consequences of those designs on their rooftops. War compresses moral complexity into outcomes. If we study only triumph, we risk missing the cost. If we study only loss, we risk missing the scale of the choices that led to it. If this account moved you, if it made you think differently about what courage and cost mean, there are simple ways to keep the conversation going. Subscribe to the channel so more stories like this are told with balance and care. Like the video if you found it meaningful. Every click helps bring these tough histories back into the light. Leave a comment with any questions or memories you want to share. You may speak of family histories or personal reflections. If you prefer privacy, feel free to tell your story anonymously. What matters is that these voices are heard. History is not only dates and hardware. It is people making choices under pressure, and it is our job to remember them with honesty and empathy. Thank you for watching, for reflecting, and for keeping these complicated stories alive.